from the shifting shadows of the imagination to the blinding light of terror. This is One Tale to Midnight.
In 1962, I was working as the chief of security at a logging camp in North Carolina. The job was simple, like breaking up fights between angry, overworked lumberjacks and take care of nuisance animals like bears and cougars. I was in charge of 30 armed men and would mitigate whose job it was to venture out deep in the mountains to guard equipment left behind at the lead cut. A place where tents were set up so they could rest before the next shift as they made their way through to Tennessee. The loggers would work 12-hour shifts, then they were carried by cable car here to the base camp. Then my officers would spend the weekend keeping guard at the lead camp. I had been out on quite a few of these for training purposes, but most of my time had been spent at the base. One night, I received a call over the radio. It was one of my guys screaming hysterically about a big, hairy, wild man with glowing red eyes attacking their camp. Then the radio went silent. The camp was about quarter-mile west of the cable car drop. I woke up a group of 5 men, Jim, Franklin, Steve, Richard, and Tom. With rifles in hand, we headed up the mountain. The cable car ride took about 1 hour and 45 minutes, and the hike to camp took another hour. By the time we arrived, it was just past midnight. The embers from the fire still glowed. The camp had been totally destroyed, ripped tents, tables overturned, and all the equipment strewn about. So we rekindled the fire to get some more light, other than just our flashlights. That's when we noticed there was blood everywhere, and the place looked as though it had been sat upon by several large bears. However, the footprints told a different story. They were the prints of a rather large barefoot man. The clearest one was about 18 inches long and 9 inches wide, and they were everywhere. The 6 men that were guarding the camp were nowhere to be found. I decided that we should track back up the roughly cut logging road and set up our camp away from this disturbing scene. To say my men were on the edge would be an understatement. While being armed with several Winchester 30-30s and Colt 45s, I suspected they wouldn't have the desired effect on this creature, say, as they would a bear. We were underarmed, considering this thing must have been upwards of 10 feet tall, with the depth of the impressions left by the prints. By 2 a.m., we had large fires burning on the 4 corners of our camp. We knew that there would be no sleep as we huddled in the center of our new camp, clutching our rifles. Then at 3 a.m., we heard 3 loud knocks that filled the night. They rippled through the cool air and took everyone off guard. Heads darted around in all directions, our eyes straining, trying to see beyond the flicker of the flames. Jim was the first of us to speak. "What the hell?" His deep voice crackled. I looked at him and said, "Steady." Franklin, who sat to my left, spoke up. "Could it be moonshiners?" To my right was Steve. He explained, "Moonshiners wouldn't bring attention to themselves, and they sure as shit didn't leave those prints." Then 3 more knocks echoed out, but this time from the opposite direction. Then 3 more from the direction of the first direction. Tom leapt to his feet, putting the rifle to his shoulder, aiming it toward the sound from the first north direction, as did Richard. Franklin and I covered the south direction. Rifles were at the ready, their sights looking for a target. Then a terrible silence fell, so quiet we could hear each other breathing. Tom spoke over his shoulder. "Mike, what are we doing?" I replied. "Don't fire until you have something to shoot at." Just then a large rock, the size of a small cantaloupe, soared over Franklin to my right. My eyes followed it as it struck Steve in the back of his head, knocking him to the ground. Franklin fired his rifle in the direction he thought it came from. Richard, who was next to Steve, knelt down. "Damn," he cried out. "Steve's dead." Franklin had fired off several rounds, and I yelled, "Stop shooting." He looked at me wide-eyed. "What do we do?" "Get to the center of camp and keep your rifles ready," I said. As we gathered, back to back, we heard a large crashing noise coming from the north. Richard began to fire his rifle, round after round, until his rifle was empty. I turned to see him fumbling through his pockets, trying to find his reload, but it was too late. The huge beast plowed through Richard, knocking him into Tom. They both went flying through the air. Tom managed to keep a hold of his rifle, and after he recovered from the fall, jumped to his feet and fired a round in the back of the fleeing beast. Again, it fell silent, the 5 of us shifting our rifles from one to the other. "Franklin," I yelled, "check on Richard." Franklin slowly lowered his rifle and knelt beside Richard. "Mike, I think he's dead." The attack had only lasted for a few seconds, but I had lost 2 men to these giant wild hairy beasts. A few minutes passed, then from the darkness, a whooping sound filled the air. The sounds coming from different directions. It made my blood run like ice. Then another and another. Franklin yelled, "We need to get the hell out of here." "I'm with Franklin," Jim said. Then there were more crashing sounds, this time from the south. The flames flickered to silhouette the beast. We all turned facing the direction with rifles pointing. Tom spoke up, "I know I hit that thing." Just then a rock came from the darkness, causing us to flinch. Tom yelled, "I got another bullet for you, you son of a bitch." "Look, I know you shot it, but I think it's really pissed," Jim said. "But if that's the one you shot, it didn't scare him one bit. The beast's red eyes had to have been at least 10 feet in the air, and the smell. Damn, that smell filled the entire camp. It was like a wet dog ate a skunk, then fell into an outhouse. I mean, it was everywhere." "Fire," I yelled. The shots rang out, one after another. The beast shielded its face from our hail of bullets, then in a fraction of a second turned and vanished back into the dark woods. I yelled out to the men to reload their rifles. I knew it would return at any moment. This assault wasn't over, but at least, this time, we didn't lose anyone. Then a deeper whoop sound started, long and mournful. "Shit," Jim said. "How many times did we shoot that thing?" "I don't know, maybe 10, Tom replied. I shook my head. "No, I heard 7. "Damn, those things are tough," Tom said in a hushed tone. Just as he finished, more rocks came hurling in our direction, causing us to fan out and separate. Franklin got hit with the 3rd rock and dropped to the ground. I wasn't sure if he was dead, but he sure wasn't getting up. Jim and Tom opened fire, wildly ratcheting their lever actions. The muzzle fire lit up the darkness as the beast darted with extreme agility from tree to tree. This hulk of a beast was fast, and either man wasn't able to keep track of where he had gone. Jim muttered as he reloaded, "I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch." Then, like a flash, the creature jumped between us and knocked Jim to the ground with a venomous roar. Then swung at Tom, sending him flying into a tree. It back was to me, and I saw my chance. I leapt into the air and jammed the barrel of my .30 into the back of the beast's neck, pulling the trigger. The shot rang out as the beast screamed with a terrible sound. I landed in front of this thing and ratcheted another round. Quickly I pointed my rifle at its disturbingly human face and fired again. The creature went from clawing at the back of its head to cupping its face with its hands. Another rock came for the darkness, flying between me and this wounded monster, just as it lowered its hand. Its fur around the neck was wet, and the shot I put in its face had left it partly scalped with blood flowing over its left eye. Still on my knees, I scurried back 2 or 3 feet while reloading, cocking another round in the .30. The creature bent slightly at the waist and roared, sending droplets of blood on my face. I took aim again. This time my sights found its left knee. Again, not more than 5 feet from this giant, I squeezed the trigger, and yet again, my bullet found its target. The creature's knee buckled, sending its heaving weight to all fours with a loud thud. I jumped to my feet, jacking another round into the chamber. It was at this moment I realized how large this thing was. Even though I had brought it to its knees, it was still a foot taller than me. Its painful groans vibrated in my chest. I raised my rifle once again, this time aiming at its flat nose, covered in blood. At that moment, it raised its right hand and began shaking it, like it was waving me off. This gave me pause. The fear and anger that once coursed through my veins was replaced with curiosity and maybe a hint of compassion. I approached this massive beast, rifle still at the ready. I got closer than I would ever have imagined. I steadied myself as I prepared to pull the trigger, sending that final bullet through its head. Just then, I was struck by a large rock. It hit my shoulder, ripping the rifle from my hand and sending me crashing to the ground. I was hurt, and for the first time that night, without my rifle. I turned my head to search for Jim and Tom, but they were gone. Then I looked toward the creature that I had put 3 rounds in, only to see the other creature helping it to its feet. I reached as best that I could for the Colt 45 on my hip. My shoulder ached from the rock impact. As I drew my revolver, the creature, who seemed even larger than the first, snapped its head in my direction. Its face, filled with what I can only describe as immense hate, began to charge me. I scurried backwards as I fanned the hammer of my revolver, sending 4 rounds directly into its chest. It didn't even flinch. The beast closed the gap in a flash and then kicked me like a football. I heard my ribs crack and my neck strain trying to keep a hold of my head. I toppled end over end, down the ridge and landing hard in a gully. That was the moment I lost consciousness. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of my name being called. It was Jim. He was alive. My chest hurt and my neck felt like it was an inch longer, but I, too, was alive. I crawled up to the ridge to see him still searching the trees with his rifle at the ready. "Jim," I called out. "I'm over here." His head whipped around to look at me. "Is Tom with you?" "No." Shaking my head, I got kicked down the ridge. I said, looking around last night's battlefield. Steve and Richard's bodies were missing, and Tom was nowhere to be found. "So, we're the only ones left?" I asked. Jim nodded. "Far as I can tell." "Did you happen to find a radio?" I asked. "Yep, all smashed to smithereens, but I did find a rifle and a pistol that weren't busted all to pieces," he said, pointing toward the base of a tree. I shook my head. "Well, at least I won't feel defenseless," I said as I picked up the firearms. I checked the action of each, then reloaded them, putting the Colt in my holster and resting the Winchester on my shoulder. Jim was watching me intently. "What are we gonna do, boss?" His voice was full of uncertainty. "Well," I said, "we don't have a radio to call for help, and base camp is about a 9-hour hike from here." Again, Jim asked, "What are we gonna do, Mike?" "Well, the logging crew won't be here until the day after tomorrow, so I guess we're hiking," I replied. Jim looked me up and down, then said, "Look at you. You can hardly stand." "Well, I ain't staying here another night, not without the National Guard," I replied. Jim nodded. "Well, let's get to gettin'." With that, we began to make our way back to base. It was a hard hike. My head was pounding, and my coughs were now mixed with blood. Jim led the way down the rough logging trail until we reached the bottom of the valley, where I had to stop. We had been walking about 4 hours, and it seemed that we were just halfway there. I could tell Jim was getting jittery. He kept looking back in the direction we came from and fiddling with his rifle. "We ain't gonna make it out of here before nightfall." The tone in his voice was filled with despair. Then in the distance came 3 knocks, just like the night before. Jim jumped to his feet, looking up the logging trail. "Shit, they're coming!" he shouted before bolting up the mountain, not looking back. I couldn't blame him. Don't know if I would have done the same, but I couldn't blame him. I sat there on the ground watching Jim fade off in the distance. When 3 more knocks came, this time closer, I struggled to get to my feet and really didn't have the strength to raise my rifle. I just stood there, waiting for what hellish revenge these things were getting ready to unleash. 3 more knocks rang out, this time in front of me in the direction of Jim. I wondered if they were surrounding me or going after him. Then I heard whooping sounds again, just like last night, but this time they were both ahead of me. They were going after Jim. I heard a rifle fire a few times and Jim yelling. I wondered if he was close enough to base camp for them to hear. Then it went silent. No more gunshots. And at that moment, I knew Jim had met his fate. Just stood there awaiting. What terror was waiting for me? My head and neck hurt, and every time I took a breath, there was sheer pain. I was dizzy and began drifting in and out of consciousness. I fell to my knees, still staring up the mountain, then I blacked out. The next thing I remember is being jostled around. I opened my eyes to see the back of a military uniform. They put me in the cable car, and I was headed back to base camp. From there to the hospital, I was questioned by several high-ranking military officers, and I told every detail of that night. They listened carefully to my story. Then they told me not to divulge any information about that night, not even my supervisor. Their warning had a strong overtone that told me incarceration would be the least of my problems. I took that to heart, never speaking of that night, until now. I felt like I needed to honor the 10 men that vanished that night in the mountains of the Blue Ridge.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, because I have more tales to tell.